So are you ready for a good yarn? Because I've got one. Not for sin, but for sentiment and stupidity. Mark Twain's brief and unhappy association with the Connecticut Prisoners Friends Society. When Sam and Livy Clemens moved to Hartford in 1871, they quickly embraced the progressive, civic-minded ethos of their new community. Livy, for her part, became deeply involved with the city's Union for Homework, a social service organization dedicated to helping poor women and children. And in 1873 and 75, Mark Twain harnessed his growing literary celebrity to offer benefit lectures on behalf of the popular local missionary David Hawley, the latter of which produced a windfall of over $1,200, which is the equivalent of $35,000 today, for the non-denominational Hartford mission. In this respect, it is perhaps not surprising that in January 1875, when Clemens's Nook Farm neighbor and literary collaborator, Charles Dudley Warner, spearheaded the establishment of a benevolent statewide organization called the Prisoners Friends Society, dedicated to the support and rehabilitation of recently paroled convicts, that he agreed to serve on its advisory board. Although it was previously believed that Clemens's affiliation with this group was largely ceremonial, and that he did not actively participate in advancing its reformist agenda, numerous unpublished documents at both the Mark Twain Papers and the Mark Twain House and Museum, primarily letters to the writer rather than by him, letters to him from now obscure individuals, reveal a very different story. Based on this newly recovered evidence, the historical record now stands fleshed out and corrected. Clemens's involvement with the Prisoners Friends Society was in fact substantive but short-lived, lasting approximately 14 months from March 1875 through May 1876, and culminated in an abrupt, acrimonious resignation, the circumstances surrounding which I'll be sharing in this presentation. His experience on the group's advisory board was, moreover, bookended by uncomfortable personal encounters with two incorrigible career criminals, both incarcerated at Wethersfield State Prison. Here you go. An imposing brick edifice on the banks of the Connecticut River, about 6 miles from his home. Mark Twain's disillusionment with the naivete of the Society's goals eventually became fodder for his fiction, specifically an 1880 satire called Edward Mills and George Benton, A Tale, published in The Atlantic, that name-checks the Prisoners Friends Society 3 times within the space of 6 pages as a prime example of gushing sentimentality over crime. According to the Society's 1875 Articles of Association, individuals tapped for the advisory board were selected from among its life patrons and honorary members for life, categories reflecting the highest level of financial commitment, so respectively contributions of $500 or $100, suggesting that Clemens made a sizable donation to the cause. Other members, however, deemed to be philanthropic, honorable, and judicious counselors were also eligible for service. Because the organization's early membership rosters unfortunately no longer exist, it is impossible to determine the exact amount of Clemens's contribution. Nonetheless, whether he was a life patron or an honorary one, membership in the society was incontrovertibly a prerequisite of service. The role of the advisory board was twofold. On the one hand, symbolic, enhancing the organization's legitimacy through the prestige of their names, while on the other, pragmatic, providing financial support for, quote, board, clothing, and other necessaries to assist discharged convicts in living honorably. A 1935 history of the association reveals that of the 15 men appointed to the Society's first advisory board in March 1875, 8 of them, Joseph Hawley, Henry Robinson, and Judge Nathaniel Shipman, among others, were also members of the Monday Evening Club and personal friends of Clemens. Their service was, in other words, a local grassroots effort. The first test of Clemens's commitment to the cause of prisoner reform occurred in early December 1875, when a mysterious package was dropped off under the cover of darkness at the porte cochere of his Hartford residence. Inside was a large, intricately inlaid wooden model of a three-masted barque named the Mark Twain, accompanied by a rambling, incoherent 10-page letter from its creator, one John Wesley Hart, a burglar, then serving the second of 4 lengthy sentences at Wethersfield prison. Hart, who was eventually declared insane in 1903, had a weakness for alcohol, which, according to the Hartford Current, fueled his, quote, irresistible impulse to commit burglary, in particular, a predilection for stealing silverware from affluent homes. His 1875 letter to Clemens reads in part, and get ready, Dear Sir, I have never had the distinguished pleasure of beholding your countenance, but I have luxuriated in the unprecedented literary production of your splendid genius, from which flows a broad and sparkling stream of wit, whose healing properties for the burdensome ills which vex mankind are more efficacious than all the nostrums and homilies concocted by the whole combined medical and biological doctors of the present day. I have spent the greater portion of my checkered and stormy life at sea, and a sailor's heart will beat in my heart until I drift out upon the shadowy bosom of eternity's shoreless ocean. It may be tainted with heedless crime committed while under the insane influence of that terrible and pitiless enemy of mankind, rum. But I thank God, not pharisaical, that it is not contaminated with chicanery of any sort or hue. The miniature ship accompanying this inky monstrosity, and by the way, it's almost 4 feet long and about 3.5 feet tall, so it's a biggin, okay? The miniature ship accompanying this inky monstrosity, I, with infinite patience, manufactured in my leisure hours, using no other tools but a jackknife and an awl. And I'm just gonna ask you to think for a second about a time in which prisoners were allowed knives while they were incarcerated. Moving on, okay? The hull is pine, planked with ebony. The standing rigging is black linen, and the running silk thread is all laid up by hand. I present the model to you in the self-same spirit which you present your good gifts to the fruit of your loins. The model, which miraculously has survived for 150 years, and perhaps even more miraculously found its way back to the Mark Twain House and Museum in the 1930s, is an absolute marvel. So just, I don't know how close you'll be able to see this, but from its carved eagle figurehead, miniature cannons, brightly painted red lifeboat suspended from the ship's rigging, to its elaborate marquetry and deck furniture. I mean, can you see the little, I'm sorry. There's little tables and chairs. It's really quite amazing. And yet, the ship also presented Clemens with a thorny dilemma. As a member of the Prisoners Friends Society Advisory Board, he felt obliged not only to acknowledge Hart's gesture, but also to somehow compensate him for it. Although the writer's half of the correspondence no longer exists, the substance of his communication with the prisoner can be deduced from Hart's second letter, dated the 26th of December. I am proud to know that the ship has given a gentleman of your refined artistic taste pleasure, and I heartily thank you for your compliments respecting my seamanship. Every word of it is appreciated. You also say that your conscience will upbraid the rest of your system if you accept it as a gift. If your conscientious scruples debar you from receiving it, here is the balm of Gilead. My aged parents are somewhat indigently circumstanced, and I have not the least doubt that a few dollars will cause their hearts to leap with joy. They live in Middletown, Connecticut, and anything you choose to send them will be gratefully appreciated, and of course, a pleasure to me. 2 days later, Clemens sent a check for $50, an amount equal to $1,500 today, to the prisoner's father, a shoemaker named Lorenzo Hart. This windfall, which likely represents at least 3 times Mr. Hart's annual salary as a tradesman, elicited a note of gratitude that is now preserved at the Mark Twain Papers. Dear Sir, your kind letter of December 28th reached me yesterday. It was quite unexpected. Although I received a letter from my son telling me about the ship, I feel grateful to you for your liberality and hope the interest you have taken in his work may influence his mind to better things. In 2019, Hart's ship model was displayed in the Twain's Attic exhibit at the Mark Twain House. When a member of the curatorial staff was dusting it prior to installation, she noticed a small card wedged beneath the decking. And this is what it reads: Sir Master Jack Bunce, with the sincere regards of Mrs. S.L. Clemens. This suggests that soon after the arrival of Hart's gift, probably in January 1876, Livy took the matter of the ship into her own hands, presenting it as a gift to Jack Bunce, the 7-year-old son of the family's close friend, Ned Bunce, who was a local insurance executive. It was Bunce's daughter who donated the boat back to the museum in 1934. In early 1878, about 2 years after receiving the ship's model, Clemens learned that the generous remuneration he paid to Hart's father had indeed influenced the prisoner's mind, though perhaps not in the way he had anticipated. On 20 February 1878, the Hartford Courant carried this squib in its brief mention column. Wesley Hart, a state prison convict, has made a miniature ship, full-rigged and handsomely painted, which he has named after and presented to Colonel F.W. Cheney. Like other ships of the kind he has made, there is much inlaid work in different woods. As with the model Clemens received in December 1875, Hart's gift to Cheney, a wealthy industrialist who was a longtime member of the Monday Evening Club, but had no direct affiliation with the Prisoners Friends Society, was also accompanied by a long, inscrutable letter about the soul's immortality and the prospect of an afterlife, which offers some useful context. During the last 3 years, remember, he had a lot of time on his hands, okay? I have built 3 sister ships to this one and have disposed of them for the sole benefit of my aged and infirm parents. Mark Twain had the first, for which he gave my mother $50. Honorable T.W. Allen had the second, for which he gave her the same amount. Governor Jewell has the third. In other words, Clemens' largesse became the template for an ingenious money-making scheme, a prison-based cottage industry, if you will, in which Hart and his elderly mother worked as a tag team. He would craft and send the model, along with a letter, just happening to mention the amount that Mark Twain had paid for it. A few days later, Hart's mother would descend upon the unsuspecting recipient's doorstep, pleading the case of her wrongfully incarcerated son and refusing to leave without some compensation for the gift. This strategy worked with Hartford businessman T.W. Allen, likely because Mark Twain's name was invoked. Former Connecticut Governor Marshall Jewell, however, proved to be a different story. 2 days after the current squib appeared, Jewell sent Frank Cheney a letter of warning. I too found a ship model at my house some time ago, for which I had no use. It indicated that somebody had spent a great deal of time on it, and I wondered who was fool enough to do it. Sometime afterward, an old lady called, and said she was the mother of the godly person who made that ship, and that he was in durance vile, though innocent as a lamb. Mrs. Jewell, like the kind-hearted lady that she is, took $10 worth of stock in the old lady's story, and the ship, with all its sails spread, still graces the top of a bookcase in my library. I do not think $10 is high to get rid of that old lady. Knowing Knowing that Mrs. Cheney's heart and purse are both larger than Mrs. Jewell's, I concluded the old woman would get at least $50 out of her if Mrs. Cheney allowed her the time to complete her argument. This thing is really comedy, and I smile now as I think of that old lady bearing down with all her sails set to urge upon Mrs. Cheney and yourself to reward her good son who is so abused by the law. There are a good many innocent people who are not in state's prison, who ought to be there. But I hope when they do get there, they will not make ships. In a quandary about how to proceed, Frank Cheney then reached out to Clemens for advice, who responded on the 24th of February. My dear Mr. Cheney, he sent the ship here at night by 2 men who delivered it to the servant and said it was a present from me, from the maker, and then drove off. A letter in 3 volumes or thereabouts accompanied the thing. I was in a pretty uncomfortable place. I couldn't hurl the man's present at his head, neither could I accept it from a prisoner. I wrote and said I would sell the ship for him if he set a price, or buy it myself at $50. He said send the $50 to his aged father at Middletown, which I did. I have never seen Wesley Hart, but from what I have heard, he must be a criminal whose crimes are modified, softened, almost neutralized by his native chuckleheadedness. He entered Mrs. Henry Perkins' house once to rob it, collected the silver together, then lay down on the sofa to take a nap, and didn't wake anymore till Mrs. Perkins called him to breakfast. True story, by the way. All right. A year ago, he walked out of jail and came hanging around my neighbor Holbrook's barn, telling Holbrook that as soon as night came, he would call on me and I would furnish him with the money to go west with. Then Holbrook went downtown and told an officer, and poor Hart was back at Wethersfield before he had been missed, for he hadn't been away from there for more than 2 days. I am very glad you wrote me, and I wish I had something more substantial to tell. Suppose you write the warden at Wethersfield. I did that once with a good result, part of which was that I proved to my own probably prejudiced satisfaction that the Prisoners Friends Association ought to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, not for sin, but for sentiment and stupidity. In several ways, this letter represents the linchpin of my argument. On the one hand, reflecting Clemens' sympathy for the native chuckleheadedness of poor Hart, yet on the other, offering a disconcerting reality check about the unintended consequences of his earlier generosity. Hart's intention to show up at Clemens' doorstep under the presumption that he would furnish him money to go west with must have troubled the writer, both in terms of jeopardizing the security of his home and young family, as well as the legal implications of Hart's expectation. Under Connecticut law, assisting in a fugitive's escape was a serious crime, in fact, a felony. But the most significant detail in Clemens' 1878 letter to Cheney is the clue it provides regarding his second encounter with a paroled prisoner through the Prisoners Friends Society, the chain of events that ultimately precipitated his resignation from its advisory board. On May 2nd, 1876, the Wethersfield prison released Ira Gladding, a notorious forger described in the Hartford Courant as a man with no moral sense whatsoever, who was perfectly uncontrollable in his criminal impulses. Like Wesley Hart, Gladding was a serial offender. By the time of his death in 1914, at age 82, he had spent more than 40 years behind bars. In March 1874, Gladding was pardoned by President Ulysses S. Grant through the intercession of a female novelist named Anne S. Stevens. Freed from Wethersfield prison in early April, he returned to his old habits within a matter of days, purchasing expensive jewelry with forged checks, and was promptly rearrested. In the spring of 1876, Clemens was apparently asked by the Prisoners Friends Society to provide financial assistance for Gladding's relocation to Cleveland, prompting the query to Wethersfield's warden alluded to in his letter to Frank Cheney. While Clemens' letter apparently does not survive, Warden E.B. Hughes's unequivocal response does, and it's right here. Dear sir, yours of the 10th inst is at hand in regard Ira Gladding. He is a discharged prisoner, was discharged the 2nd inst. He has been confined in this prison 4 different times. And we regard him as a man that will steal and defraud people before he will work. He is a good workman when he takes hold and is very ingenious. I don't think he will work if he can beg or steal. What happened next verges on farce. On Friday, May 12th, Reverend A.H. Mead, a Methodist Episcopal Church minister who had recently been appointed as the financial agent and corresponding secretary of the Prisoners Friends Society, sent Gladding to Clemens's door with this letter of introduction. The bearer, Mr. Ira Gladding, is a newly released prisoner from our state's prison. He desires, it seems to me, to begin a new life, but his reputation is against him, and he can do nothing here. He is ingenious, industrious, able-bodied, wants to go west to Cleveland, Ohio. We as an association are not in funds just at present. If you will help him to a ticket, we will do something, and what you are pleased to do will be credited to our society as a donation. You can enclose the money to me if you prefer. I will see that it is faithfully applied to his benefit. Although Clemens's correspondence with Reverend Mead has not yet been recovered, what transpired can be deduced from details contained in the flurry of subsequent letters Mead sent to him on May 15th, May 18th, and May 20th. While at Clemens's home, Gladding apparently promised to hand-deliver the writer's response to Mead containing his $5 donation toward the parolee's railway ticket. This sum, equal to about $150 today, is hardly insignificant. Nonetheless, it represents just 1/10 of the amount Clemens had sent to Lorenzo Hart as compensation for the ship's model just 6 months earlier, suggesting that either Warden Hughes's sobering assessment of the prisoner's character had reached him before Gladding arrived, or that he was growing skeptical of the Prisoner Friends Society naive views on criminality and recidivism. No sooner had Gladding left the Clemens mansion than he tore open the letter and confiscated the cash, reporting to Mead that Mark Twain had gone to New York City and was not at home when he called. Meanwhile, the minister's original plan to escort Gladding to the train depot on Monday, May 15th. So this is a very tight chronology, right? May 12th, he shows up at Clemens's door, and then this is what happens the following Monday. The original plan was to escort Gladding to the train station and purchase his one-way ticket to Cleveland. When he learned that on Saturday, May 13th, Gladding had scaled the walls of Wethersfield prison, broken into its on-site shoe manufacturing workshop, where he worked during a previous sentence, and stolen a pair of boots, for which he was immediately rearrested and placed in solitary confinement. Thus, within 10 days of being paroled, Gladding was back inside. By summer, he had pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 4 more years in his former home. Judging from the tenor of Mead's letters, Clemens was furious about being dragooned into this fiasco, and no doubt also rankled by the sanctimonious, patronizing tone in which the minister addressed him. While conceding that Gladding was an incorrigible case, Mead remained convinced of the fundamental worth of the society's goals and lobbied Clemens to continue supporting its cause. He faulted the writer for his cynicism and repeatedly asked him to attend the association's annual meeting on May 24th and make a key address to those present. I have, I think, facts that will rekindle your sympathy and enthusiasm. No philanthropic movement for the erring and unfortunate will be or ever has been uniformly and unvaryingly successful in every case. A physician, lawyer, author, minister, even the gospel of the Lord have cases of effort hopeless, and yet many that repay the labor and cost. Shall efforts to save the criminal, even the habitually criminal, be an exception? How about efforts to save the drunkard, etc.? Review your ground carefully. Is it tenable? Excuse me for these suggestions. I want your heart help, and I think I ought to have it in the case, in spite of gladding. 2 days later, Meade contacted Clemens again, chiding him in an even more overt, high-handed terms. It is clear to me that you do not quite understand the purposes and aims of our organization, or your estimate of it would be materially changed. No man having the judgment and the heart you have could withhold sympathy, fully understanding the work we propose doing. This case is unfortunate, I grant, but it also does not vitiate the claims of the society to support, any more than a lifeboat failing to save all of a shipwrecked crew should be condemned as useless and unworthy. Gladding's case proves the need of an organization like the APC to protect the really undeserving unfortunate. If all in our penal institution were like Gladding, I would shake hands with you in the most unsparing condemnation, but they are not. Happily, his is universally allowed to be the exceptional case. Do not let us allow his act to harden our hearts against the truly deserving unfortunate. Let us be more cautious, less credulous, if you please. I do not think I will be caught napping by another Gladding. In the meantime, let me ask you to hold your mind free from prejudice. Then, when the light comes, it will find no difficulty of entrance. Meade's closing image, representing Mark Twain as a benighted soul, trapped in the darkness of his prejudice, must have incensed him. No further communication between the two men survives. I am, however, still combing local state and church archives in the hopes of finding Clemens's letters, which I imagine are utterly volcanic in their fury. The spiritual enlightenment Meade so fervently hoped for never did materialize. Mark Twain instead resigned from the advisory board of the Prisoners Friends Society and effectively severed all ties with the organization. Over time, his rancor lingered and deepened, as reflected in the verdict expressed in his 1878 letter to Frank Cheney that the Prisoners Friend Association ought to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, not for sin, but for sentiment and stupidity. Thank you.